Hello and welcome to Compact21, the combined regional conferences of the Midwestern and Western regions. We were just listening to a musical selection from a student from one of our member campuses, Mott Community College, Cole Smith. You'll be hearing a little bit more from some students and their musical selections as we go through the conference. We are so excited to have you all here as we talk about our conference theme, the promise of full participation, resilience, and responsibility for racial and environmental justice. These two components of systemic injustice have resulted in the unkept promise of full and equitable participation in education, employment, healthcare, and environmental quality. The Western region held their Continuums of Service conference on March 17th with a focus on environmental justice. If you didn't have a chance to see it, we'll make sure to put a link to the recording in the chat. We feel strongly about committing to racial justice here in the Midwest and as Campus Compact as a national organization. We have taken steps toward honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation by acknowledging the traditional native lands on which we reside. Given that we are gathering for today's conference from across the country and around the world, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Native people where you are joining us from in the chat. I am participating from East Lansing, Michigan, which occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, Michigan State University resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold ourselves and others accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Also, we want to recognize and be in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice in equitable communities. We commit to move beyond words into actions and programs that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. So before we go any further, just please note, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Nicole Springer. I'm the Director of Institutional Capacity Building with Campus Compact. We have a couple of tech reminders before we go over the agenda. So first of all, this is set up as a meeting and not a webinar, which means that we can see and hear you. And so we'd really love to see your faces, but we're asking you to keep yourselves muted if you're not speaking. The second thing is, while we can control some things from our side, we may not be able to control the screen view. So if you want to, you may want to select speaker view so that you're seeing the speakers, or you can pin the presenters. We're going to try to do the best from our end, but if you're not seeing it, use those tools. The other note is that we are recording the conference, and so it will be available to you for parts that you might miss a little bit later. And then finally, we will be breaking into small groups for discussion. So our hope is to keep these groups around 5 to 6 people, and we invite and encourage you to stay to be a part of those groups. So what we're going to do is, you can see the agenda on your screen. We're going to start with the President's address, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We're going to have a fireside chat. We're going to give you a little break to stretch your legs and do what you need to do. We'll then have those small group chats for about 20 minutes to really dig into what we've heard from our keynote fireside chat speakers. And then we're going to come back and have the Newman Civic Fellows panel, which we'll talk about when that happens. But these are students that are Newman Civic Fellows, and they're going to talk to us about many of the topics that were brought up in the fireside chat. And then we'll close. So Campus Compact, which is the organizations that's putting this on for you today, is a national coalition of colleges and universities committed to the public purposes of higher education. We build democracy through civic education, civic action, and community development. And I could think of no one better to tell you more about Campus Compact and why our work is important than our very own president, Andrew Seligson. So Andrew, take it away.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And thank you all for being here, for joining this conversation today. And thanks especially to our leaders, Campus Compact leaders in the Midwest, and the volunteers who are helping to make all this happen and who did all the hard work of planning this event and bringing us all together. So we're gathering, as I'm sure all of you know, a year to the day after the murder of George Floyd at the hands of 4 officers of the Minneapolis Police Department. And we come together for the purpose of reflecting on racial and environmental justice in the context of our shared work in pursuit of full participation. And so I wanted to say a few words about Campus Compact's mission and how we understand it in practice, how it connects to the theme of this convening, and what I hope we might all take away from today's conversations. So at Campus Compact, our work, as Nicole said, is motivated by a vision of full participation. And we mean that word full in 2 distinct senses. The first sense emphasizes who is participating. Full participation means that everyone must have substantively equal access to participation. That means not only creating pathways to participation for everyone, it also means removing the barriers that make those pathways inaccessible for many. It means confronting the inequities in housing and employment, in policing, in criminal justice, in health, and in education that prevent full and effective participation based on race, on class, ethnicity, and many other illegitimate factors. So that's one sense of full participation, that it should be really everyone. And the second sense of full emphasizes the participation itself. Full participation means equal opportunity to participate in the economic, the social and cultural, and the political life of our communities and our country. It means meaningfully having equal opportunity to shape the future of the community one belongs to and our country as a whole. And at Campus Compact, we believe that every social institution must be mobilized both to create pathways to full participation and to confront and destroy the barriers. Among those institutions is higher education, which plays an outsized role in this effort, not only because it is among the largest institutions in many communities, and many of you know this, the college or university is a big employer, a big real estate developer, a big creator or preventer of opportunity for many people. But higher education also has a special role because it shapes what counts as knowledge, and it educates students for participation in the ways we've discussed. Just this week, Ebony McGee, a professor of STEM education at Vanderbilt University, published a piece in the journal Nature Reviews Cancer, in which she showed that the deep racial biases embedded in cancer research and in STEM education, that is to say STEM education itself, have contributed to the disproportionate cancer burden borne by African Americans. She argues in response for race-conscious, equity, and community-driven STEM research, and she maintains that STEM education will have to change to prepare the researchers who will lead this effort. The background to Professor McGee's argument is the reality of environmental racism, the exposure of communities of color to a disproportionate share of the burden of the toxicity generated by an economy that disproportionately serves white Americans. Environmental justice names the alternative to environmental racism, a reality in which the burdens of human activity are borne proportionately to the benefits, precisely the opposite of the situation we have. The accelerating climate crisis, which is already deepening existing inequities, simply heightens the urgency of an already critical question. Environmental racism, with its devastating impacts on health and thus the capacity of individuals and families to sustain themselves, is a barrier to full participation that suffuses every aspect of life: the ability to gain an education, to earn a living, to care for one's children, to invest time and energy in pursuing greater justice. So we're fortunate today to have such terrific guests, Antoinette Carroll and Ken Reardon, our Newman Civic Fellows, and others with us to help us think through these profound challenges and explore how we as individuals and institutional players can take practical steps in the direction of full participation in just and equitable communities. So I hope you leave this conversation with new motivation, as well as new conceptual categories and tools for thinking about how you can play that role. I thank you again for being here and being part of the dialogue. And I will now hand it back to Nicole to move us forward.
Thank you so much, Andrew. There were some discussions in the chat asking about getting some follow-up material to link to the article. So I just wanted to put that forward to you right now so that I don't forget, but I'll definitely follow up with you a little bit later. So we are delighted to start our fireside chat in just a few moments. We, as a committee, decided that we'd like the feel for this part of the conference to be maybe a little less formal and a little more fluid. We still ask for you to remain muted, but we invite you to leave your videos on and interact with each other and the speakers using the chat feature. We have folks who will be keeping close watch for questions, and they will be presented to our facilitator for the question and answer period. So feel free to use the chat as much as possible. Now let me introduce you to our facilitator for this portion, Aaliyah Baker. So Dr. Aaliyah Baker is an associate professor at Cardinal Stritch University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She began her career in education as a classroom teacher with the Milwaukee Public School System. She earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis in multicultural education from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Aaliyah Baker connects critical theory, research, and practice in multiple local, state, national, and international settings. Her research explores race-related concerns for Black and Indigenous people of color and their experiences in the United States and abroad. She teaches graduate level courses in the departments of leadership, education, and language and literacy. She currently serves as a committee chair for research, civic action planning, and community engagement. And in 2019, Dr. Baker was named a Midwest Engaged Scholar of Campus Compact. She works to advance constructive dialogue around issues of race, identity, and culture, and advocates for responsive practice in education. So welcome to our fireside chat, and Aaliyah, the floor is yours.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Nicole, and it's so exciting to be here. Thank you for that information. Thank you, Andrew, for all of the really heartfelt and important reminders regarding our commitment and our focus on racial and environmental justice. It's absolutely my pleasure to introduce our keynote fireside chat speakers today, and I think we are all extremely excited and quite privileged to be here to be in their presence and to hear from them as thought leaders and persons who are committed to change, to the cause. So I'll start with Ken Riordan. Ken Riordan is professor and chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Community Development in the School for the Environment at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he pursues research, teaching, and outreach with resident-led revitalization efforts in economically distressed communities. Prior to joining the UMass faculty, Ken taught at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, at Cornell University, and the University of Memphis. Ken's most recent book, Building Bridges, Community and University Partnerships in East St. Louis, describes the work of a highly effective community university development partnership in one of our nation's poorest cities. Ken is a recipient of the American Institute of Certified Planners President's Award, the Dale Prize for Excellence in Urban Planning, the Ernest Linton Award for Engaged Scholarship, and the Thomas Ehrlich Award for Professional Service in recognition of his community planning and development efforts in underserved urban and rural communities. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you. I feel welcomed.
Awesome. And then our next fireside chat speaker is Antoinette Carroll. Antoinette Carroll is the founder, president, and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab, a nonprofit educating and deploying youth to challenge racial and health inequities impacting Black and Latinx populations. Within this role, Antoinette has pioneered an award-winning form of creative problem solving called equity-centered community design, which was named a Fast Company World-Changing Idea finalist. Through this capacity, Antoinette has received several recognitions and awards, including being named an ADL and Aspen Institute Civil Society Fellow, SXSW Community Service Honoree, Camelback Ventures Fellow, 4.0 Schools Tiny Fellow, St. Louis Visionary Award Honoree for Community Impact, and Essence Magazine Woke 100. Within her almost 10 years of volunteer leadership, Antoinette was named the founding chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force of AIGA, the Professional Association of Design. She's a former AIGA National Board Director and Chair Emerita of the task force. During her tenure, she founded and launched several initiatives, including the Design Census Program with Google, Racial Justice by Design Initiative, Diversity and Inclusion Residency, and the National Design for Inclusivity Summit with Microsoft. Additionally, she's the co-founder of the Design Plus Diversity Conference and Fellowship and an active member of Adobe's Design Circle. Antoinette also co-founded and designed an organization whose mission is to cultivate and activate and advocate Black, Latinx, and Indigenous designers by providing tools, resources, and training to support them on their creative career journey. Antoinette is an international speaker and facilitator, previously speaking at Google, TED, Capital One, Harvard, Stanford University, Microsoft, NASA, AIGA National Conference, and the Ohio State University, and more. We are extremely excited, honored, and thrilled to hear from our panelists this afternoon for this fireside chat today, and looking forward to engaging in this rich discussion. The chat will commence with an open question to our panelists, and we'll continue with a few questions to help us understand their service and their leadership as models for activism and injustice. The question remains, how do we engage with regard for impact and change? An overarching question we embark upon in the face of inequity, inequality, and injustice is how can we situate ourselves to be more responsive, to be resilient, and better prepared for tackling racial and environmental justice. We will invite participants to add questions to the chat. We have planned for about 30 minutes of this session to be devoted to question and answer, and I will do my best to funnel the questions to Antoinette and Ken with the help of the Compact team members. Without further ado, I'll ask the panelists to tell us a little bit more about who they are if they wish, and really kind of answering and centering the first question of, describe your work. You can answer that in any way, in any order that you'd like, but we'd love to hear from you. If you could describe your work as a volunteer leader, as a professor, as a community advocate, describe your work for us and tell us a little bit more about what it means to be committed to the cause.
Antoinette, why don't you go first?
I was going to say, you want me to start? I can start.
Yeah,
that's not a problem.
I figure.
So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all. For everyone, it's either good afternoon or almost good evening, depending on where you are. But I know it's Midwest, so I'm pretty sure we're all in the good afternoon area. And starting on just describing myself, I will first start with the reality that I'm a Black woman in the United States of America. I am a mother of Black boys. I am a wife of a Black man. And all of that centers in how I show up in spaces. So much so that I have to show, because I'm pretty sure some folks are like, what is this? I've had people ask if it's my hair. This is a Mother's Day balloon that I call my jellyfish. So I just want to just name that, because they show up in spaces with me. My sons are twins, and they are 12 turning 13 this year. And I remember how old they were when the uprising in Ferguson began, especially because my children were actually attending Ferguson School, elementary school at that time. We had just moved out of Ferguson 6 months prior to the uprising. And so this was something that was very dear and connected to our reality. And unfortunately, something that I knew at a professional level how to grapple with, but not necessarily at the personal level, to the point where I remember when the indictment or lack of indictment announcement was made. And obviously, we learned that Darren Wilson was not indicted for what happened to Michael Brown Jr. I proceeded to cry in that moment. And one of my sons asked me, why are you crying? I said, well, a young boy, particularly a young Black boy, was killed. And his first response to me was, then why don't we just call the police? And in that moment, it was so hard to tell my son that unfortunately in a lot of spaces, not just in the spaces of law enforcement, but in every environment, you may be treated differently based on the color of your skin. And so when a lot of folks ask about my work, I tell people I don't do work, I have a purpose. I moved from job to career to purpose a while ago. And Ferguson was one of those catalysts in those moments. Really kind of speeding up because I could talk for days. I'm gonna tell you that now. Summing up my work, I am a serial social entrepreneur, having started 5 different businesses, 4 of them still active, 3 of them I'm still leading. One of them actually is in honor of my late brother that was a victim of gun violence 3 years ago. He was 14 years old at the time, and a 13-year-old boy actually shot him in his bedroom over an iPhone. Yesterday would have been his 18th birthday. And so this is very real timely for me. I tell people all the time, what I do is around legacy building. It is around living expertise. It is not around what title do I have behind my name. It is not around what letters I have behind my name. I used to work in higher education. I was in, the social affairs department. I was an instructor in certain spaces. And yet I will argue that a lot of these spaces, all of these spaces, not just higher education, tend to want our students, want our professors, want our staff to show up as professionals and not show up as human beings, and understanding that professionalism that we talk about in many cases is riddled with white supremacy tenets. And so my work is trying to shatter that. And it's also looking at how do we center community members, particularly Black and Latinx youth, to be decision makers in their communities, because not only are they proximate, but they are powerful. And they have been architects of change throughout the history of this country, even before this country was stolen. And so I really think about how do we shift power to communities that have unfortunately been in historically underinvested situations, where they actually can be the leaders opposed to just being beneficiaries and being really riddled with paternalistic situations. And so I'm going to pause there because I know we could speak more and more as more questions come, but I want to just thank you all for having me here, and I'm excited for this discussion.
Wow, thank you very much, Antoinette. Ken.
Thank you, Antoinette. My heart goes out to you and your family, thinking about the loss of your brother, and to the entire African-American community and communities of color today on an important historic date. And as you identified yourself, I'm an Irish Catholic boy from the South Bronx. I grew up in an apartment building, 60 units. I was related to the occupants of 38 of them. They were my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents. In the morning, we would travel down by elevator to the lobby. We'd collect my first cousins, 38 of them from the building, and we'd walk 2 blocks to the local St. Jerome's Catholic school. It was a vibrant, multi-ethnic, but not multi-racial community. The South Bronx, people had good union jobs in manufacturing, lots of social organization around churches and church-related schools and fraternal organizations organized by unions. And in a heartbeat, in the early 1960s, the entire economic base of that neighborhood and many other urban neighborhoods throughout America disappeared as manufacturing moved to cheaper cost areas in the American South, ultimately overseas. And for me, a lot of the sense of security of being part of a tight-knit community that shared good work, good friends, and a strong multi-ethnic sense of place was undermined quickly. And I wanted to know what came to me. Why was it that our neighborhoods appeared to be written off while other neighborhoods were the beneficiaries of federal and state funding? I began to realize that the patterns that we take for granted in many urban places and rural communities are not objective forces of nature, but they're the decisions made by mere mortal men, often, sometimes women, and they're guided by the unanticipated, unexamined values and assumptions they make about the world, which are very much grounded in race, class, gender, orientation, and region. I had the great fortune as a young fellow going to high school, a Jesuit high school, to be introduced to the discussions going on in the Catholic Church in the 60s about what was the role of organized religion. And in the past, it's often been blessing the worst atrocities of those in power. And that was being contested in the early 1960s. And as part of my high school curriculum, I got the opportunity to take a class on social justice. We picked an action project. We were going to organize a hunger hike to raise funds for community organizing. We got to pick the project that we would work on. And a young priest introduced me to an obscure rural cooperative being put together by a woman by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer, who of course was the lead organizer of the Freedom Democratic Party, who inspired and supported by Robert Moses, the young African-American mathematician who left Harvard to go down and support the voter rights effort. I learned about the work of these remarkable women from agricultural areas of the South who were using their church networks to pull people together to challenge economic structures and to do it in a very vocal and public way. And that was really 50 years ago this month, my introduction to the notion that it was possible, if one had some level of opportunity and privilege, and certainly anyone who looks like me does, to choose how they would use that privilege, to reinforce patterns that marginalize so many and maybe benefit yourself, but leave you in a community where it's very hard to look your brothers and sisters in the eye and tell them that it's going to be okay when you know it's not, or to use that privilege to make a difference. I had the good fortune to go to a public university, and there some young faculty reinforced the notion that if one were going to a higher educational institution, it was supported, whether knowingly or not, by hardworking people, many of them people of color, whose own children would never cross the door of an admissions office, and that we had a special obligation to use the opportunities, the skills, the knowledge, the networks that we were being exposed to use that social capital. We could either use it to reinforce privilege or dominance or systems of oppression, or we could use it to dismantle it, to engage in what John Lewis, the great late US representative, described as good trouble. So my career has been the good trouble business. And I'm at that, we're saying, what's next? I'm jumping ahead. I'm at the point, this is my 38th year in higher ed, and I'm about ready to make room for some younger, energetic faculty. And so for me, part of the reason I was excited to meet you and be on this panel was to get some great ideas for what good trouble might look like in the third act of an aging white guy from the South Bronx.
This is wonderful. Wow. We're in for such a treat. Antoinette, Ken, thank you so much for sharing your stories. Antoinette, was there anything else that you wanted to add? I don't know if you were speaking there. Okay. It's wonderful to realize the stories that go into what it takes to be who we are, to be and show up in the spaces that we show up. So Antoinette, I really, truly, we thank you for all that you've shared with regard for the realities of the lived experiences, particularly within marginalized populations, right? And Ken, you as well, you both mentioned some really fascinating examples of how we operate in racialized ideologies that really confine us to being who we are in the current, in the status quo. And so the next question is, and it was a great segue, Ken, that you started talking about what's next. Because you mentioned these realities, sometimes this reality is that not everybody has the chance to be in those spaces, to shake things up the way that we should be shaking them up, considering the historical oppression that has occurred. How does serving in the current roles that you serve in improve your practice? How does serving as a volunteer leader, as a professor, as a community advocate, improve your practice? But more importantly, maybe in that same vein, what are the qualities, what are the dispositions necessary for us to influence sustainable change in this work? Whomever would like to go first, I'm okay with giving you the floor.
Why don't you start us this time, Ken?
Okay. Great question. Great series of questions, actually. I think for me, I was invited, had the good opportunity to come 6 years ago to Boston to set up a brand new graduate program in urban planning and community development. And as Antoinette had emphasized, the importance of knowing what the places that you are going to. And on the surface, Boston looks like a great example of a global city that is doing all the things right. Lots of investment, lots of business, lots of jobs, lots of growth, lots of new buildings, lots of money to be thrown around on bad sports teams. I'm from New York, so I can't like the Red Sox or the New England Patriots. It's the rule. It's on my birth certificate. Yet when you look deeper in Boston, which was maybe in some ways our first American city, right? The city on the hill built by the European quote unquote settlers. We see that as we've grown, the disparities in income, wealth, and power have grown along with the economy. A recent report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston found that the net worth of the average African-American family in Boston, and this is not an error, when it was studied 4 or 5 years ago, was $8. $8. The average net worth of white or Caucasian Bostonians was $287,000. And so we look at net worth, assumed intergenerational wealth is what gives you the opportunity to buy a better house, maybe closer to good jobs, better healthcare, food stores that actually have healthy, nutritious, culturally appropriate foods that are safer, that have better infrastructure, that aren't located in communities where we've put the noxious leftovers of industrial society in low-income neighborhoods. So that measure is an indication of risk. And then we look at the data from COVID-19 in Boston, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. And any white American who can stand up and say that racism is a historic phenomena should just look at the data on their city and our nation. In Boston, the likelihood that you will end up for a long hospital stay and be a victim, to die as a result of COVID-19 in the first wave, for African Americans, it was 3 times higher than for white Americans. And for Latinx communities, I'm sorry, they're all bundled together, but overall 3.3 times. So we have a situation where we have never been wealthy. We've never had more access to technology and interconnectivity as a society. And yet we are looking at a situation where the current life opportunities based upon identity is absolutely unacceptable and criminal. And yet we have a hard time building the broad base of political support to dismantle the structures of oppression and racism and the values that maintain it. And that's really our work, primarily, at this point. I can't think of anything more significant. We could talk about climate change, and I'm in the School for the Environment. We're on the edge of a major commitment to infrastructure, but will that infrastructure commitment be informed by values that talk about privileging those communities who've been victimized by past generations of public and private investment. And so far in the environmental justice movement, the climate action movement, these have not been taken seriously, even though the likelihood of victimization is so much determined by racial identity. So we have a lot of work that needs to be done. And when you look at STEM programs, underrepresentation of people of color, urban planning, grossly underrepresented. It's my 40th year as an urban planner. We still talk about it, we don't do anything. It's not rocket science. We've identified the problem, we could identify reasonable metrics, and then we have to make a commitment to making the change necessary to do affirmative recruitment, affirmative financial aid, to take a reparations approach to looking at providing support so that young people of color who've been in communities where they've been denied the opportunity to amass intergenerational wealth have the assets and resources they need to continue on their educational journey and move into positions of leadership so that their voice, so desperately needed, could be heard. And that's our task. It's good work.
Very much so. Thank you, Ken. Antoinette, would you like to add to that?
Absolutely. So I will say, you know, Ken, you said European settlers. I'm just going to call them colonizers. So I was just call them.
That's another. It's more efficient. One word.
I'm gonna just throw it out there. The way that it actually is. And it's interesting you talked about Boston because one of our chair of our board chairs at Creative Reaction Lab actually was the former Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Boston, Dr. Aaliyah Martin. And it was something that she also was recognizing that if we're talking about really building resilient cities, we need to be very mindful of the social injustices that are showing up in the spaces. And it's not enough to just talk about climate change, but how do we build resiliency? And so I would argue the same thing when it comes to any of the spaces we're in, even particularly higher education. Higher education has been a barrier of access and a barrier of power sharing since the creation of it. That I have literally been invited to higher ed into like different universities where I could tell it used to be a slave plantation. And the harm and the trauma that I felt walking onto this campus that they were asking me to speak on, I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't even think you all recognize how this could even affect how people feel included or not. And so when you ask the question of how does serving my current role impact my practice, you know, I created my role. You know, I used to be, I've worked in agency, I've worked in higher education, I've worked in corporate, I've worked also in different nonprofit institutions. And what I found was there were strengths in some, and there were a lot of challenges and issues in a good amount of them. And with being a social entrepreneur, and now I lead the main organization I lead, which is Creative Reaction Lab, we are a nonprofit. However, we challenge the nonprofit industrial complex. We challenge that nonprofit is just, let's receive some charitable donations and apparently have this very scarcity-based mindset. We challenge the nonprofits that essentially were created just to always, you know, be around. Like the point of a nonprofit should be to actually dissolve because the problem has been addressed. And want to be very mindful because of our model, because we have our revenue stream as well, we've had more flexibility to address a lot of systemic inequities that politically different organizations did not want to support. I've had several organizations and funders come to me in which we will not change who we are for a funder. That's just never happening. That will come to me and say, we can't address X topic because that is a political topic for us. Well, I hate to break it to you, but humanity is ultimately politics. Everything, there is a choice, and there is also a spectrum of different perspectives as it relates to that choice. And so when we are addressing these issues, we can't afford to have censoring or have folks say, well, we can't address, for instance, the war on drugs that led to the continual just destroying of Black communities, of Black families, we can't say, can't not work in that space. And yes, I know that was a double. Don't come for me, all the English people. But, like we've had funders say, well, we can't do work in the cannabis industry, and yet don't want to address the fact, for instance, in the cannabis industry, that there are now $billion, like billionaires in that industry that are primarily white. But yet there have been communities destroyed for decades that were Black and Latinx and other communities of color because they did the exact same thing. And it's the same when you think about housing, when you think about education, when you think about all these spaces, because we always want to change things for the better when it's for white community members, but when it's done by other community members, then we want to say, well, no, it can't be done, or no, it's problematic, or no, it challenges safety, oh no, oh no, oh no. And so our model and our organization allows us the flexibility to get to the root cause of these issues versus trying to erase them for this more centered narrative. I also want to add in this piece, Ken, you mentioned the racial wealth gap, right? Like when we are actually looking at these larger issues, we need to understand that the issues that we are addressing impact life expectancy, quality of life, and the perceptions that we have about ourselves and others. We at our organization actually named 4 different sectors, narrative and livelihood shapers. Education is one of them. We also have government public service, we have health and healthcare, we have media and technology. These are very large sectors, but they impact how we show up in spaces, the confidence we have on ourselves, and also how we engage with others and the biases that we have. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found that every 7 minutes, a Black person dies prematurely due to the effects of racial discrimination. Every 7 minutes. Some of that is, of course, intersected in class, but honestly, you can't tell a person's class if they're dressed down in clothes, and I shouldn't have to put on a suit for you to see me. And so when we are looking at these larger grandiose issues, we can't just say, oh, that happens in that community or that happens over there. They are happening every single day within our institutions. And unfortunately, we all are actually upholding these systems because it's the systems we were born into. We all are navigating that culture. And if we want to pretend otherwise, then there is a lot that needs to be done to unpack that within ourselves. And so I want to speak, Aaliyah, to another piece, another element of the question you brought up, which was around like the qualities, the aptitudes, attitudes. The first thing I would say is humility. You have to look at what biases, unseen areas, privileges, values, feelings, etc. How is that all showing up in the spaces in which I'm engaging? And how am I constantly unlearning some of these things as I am navigating life? We are all on that journey towards equity. We've never had an equitable society. So to think that only a certain community has it figured out is incorrect, or to think that I have done what I need to do and so I have officially accomplished it is incorrect, because we are ultimately working towards not only individual liberation, but also collective liberation. But that also means us having humility to admit when we have failed, having humility to admit when we have created harm. I personally have admitted several times when I have upheld colorism because I didn't know any better. And it's different than when you have ignorance versus when you know better and you still want to pretend that it is okay because you are too focused on upholding your pride and ego versus actually undoing these systems that we're dealing with every single day. And so the biggest piece is humility, but then it's also looking at how do you share and shift power? Depending on the environment or the situation and context, you have some form of power. Even though I grew up economically underinvested, my communities that I grew up in my family no longer exist because they were displaced due to big corporations. Even though that is a true reality and therefore a targeted area, even though I don't like the term targeted, but oppressed area, I also have to recognize that I have a privilege being an able-bodied individual. I have a privilege also having flexible housing and flexible transportation and access to healthcare and a master's degree and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of spaces in which I have privileges. And if I don't recognize that while I also have those oppressed areas, I also have those privileged areas, then we still have a ways to go and we have a ways to start. And so I'm gonna stop there, Aaliyah, but I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose that second question that you brought in.
Thank you, Antoinette, very much. Ken, did you want to add anything at this point?
No.
Okay. There are some wonderful thoughts and comments in the chat. And I also want to remind everyone that we will be using the chat to solicit some questions and to funnel them to Antoinette and Ken in the next few minutes or so as well. So please, by all means, feel free to use the chat to chronicle your questions that you have as they talk. It's important enough to know, Antoinette, you brought up something that's near and dear to my heart. Some of my mentorship in, getting into spaces in higher ed was listening to people who I admired quite a bit in those spaces say things like, you have to check your ego at the door. And so ego, in terms of humility, in terms of humanity, becomes the theory that we pride ourselves on in academic and intellectual spaces, yet fail miserably in moments when we're in the moments of practice. And so in addition to what you all have already added and helped us understand quite well, in contemporary times and looking at the ways in which we are still functioning in a lot of injustice, has it become necessary for that person operating in those spaces of privilege, with a degree, with a certain background and access as a researcher, as a scholar, as a practitioner, has it become necessary for those people to become activists? And if so, in that activism, in what other roles must practitioners or community activists function in order to help foster the change that we all want to see? What is the role? What should we be doing as researchers, as higher ed faculty and staff, community engaged organizations? How should we be functioning in order to help foster change?
So I would say, just top of mind, if it's not performative, one, and also not upholding paternalistic viewpoints. So I want to go to the latter part of your question when you talked about, being researchers. Imagine if someone came into your community, talked to you for maybe 5 minutes, if they even talk to you. Maybe they're on the side of the road just observing you and not actually saying anything. And then all of a sudden they come back in your community, they leave, and then they come back and say, now here's all the things that you need based on my perspective. How would you feel? Research is heavily harmful in most spaces. And it's always done through the lens of, well, we want to learn more, or we want things to be better. Better for whom? Is the community actually asking for this research? Are they actively co-researchers in this space? Have they initiated it? Because I'm not saying research is bad. Like, everything to me provides feedback. There should always be centering of people's voices, always. But unfortunately, what I find in a lot of spaces is that research is usually created through the university's agenda and through the researcher's lens, and not actually through the lens of the community itself. There's an organization that I love, I think they're amazing, it's called Data for Black Lives. And they directly are looking at how can community members, particularly Black community members, own their own data? Because when you think about it, when research is being presented in a community, the community actually doesn't own any of it. It then becomes the ownership of the university or the professor, and they put it in their CV and look, I'm a tenured professor now. Like, it's very individualistic. And so when I think about like what roles do researchers play, one, you need to really challenge, how am I approaching research? Is it just through my own agenda and lens? Has there been true efforts of authenticity and trust building? Or is it just so I can be published in a journal so that I can get tenure track? If it's just to be published in a journal and get tenure track, then you're not helping anyone. And I challenge, even if you say I'm an activist, more likely it's performative. And so I want to put in the other element of it. I do believe we need community activists in every single space. I tell folks all the time that I believe there's 3 spaces of creating change. Those are the folks that are the entrepreneurs that create their own, that's challenging traditional, even though we more say centered, more traditional structures of businesses. There are the entrepreneurs, the individuals that are working in pre-established businesses and trying to create change from within. And then there are the community organizers that are going to hold both of them accountable. I think all 3 of those are important. And so when you think about the role you are holding in a higher education institution or any educational institution or any community organization or just a community, geographic community in which you are living, you are an entrepreneur, or you should be. And when you're being an entrepreneur, are you actually centering more of a community activism approach? Are you centering more of an equity mindset, and not just the mindset, but also the development of interventions? Or are you, again, just centering yourself and what your intended outcomes and outputs will be? Because being an activist and being an organizer or being a person that is centering social justice means that you also are constantly grappling with, how can I improve myself? How can I also unlearn and not think that I have 100% figured it out, because no one ever will. So that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Antoinette. Ken.
Powerful thoughts. I was very fortunate, some of you have heard this story before, to have had my first academic job at the University of Illinois. And as you know, it's centrally isolated. It's 200 miles away from most places people visit on their summer travel schedule. But early on, I got asked if I would go down and meet with leaders in a community that I didn't know very much about, which was East St. Louis, Illinois. This is 1990. And I went down as a young assistant professor. I said, hi, my name is Ken. I'm here to help. And I saw people immediately doing the reverse moonwalk towards the door, putting up their religious symbols. Let me protect myself from other people who look just like this guy who promised to be committed to be helpful. And at that point, the leader of this network of African-American church women brought out 3 milk containers, used to hold milk bottles, filled with reports done by my university in 1970, 1980, 1990s, increasing values in terms of the dollars that got generated, and then proceeded to inform me that not a single one of the improvements outlined in any of these 35 reports had ever been implemented, that people had been used, as sort of universities describe urban labs, as sort of an opportunity to go out and collect data, do data mining, strip mining on declining conditions in older industrial or rural communities, get their data, publish the reports, get promoted. The university, of course, getting 50% of the overhead, while the community is left with no discernible, useful information, no new structures, no new policies, but have another series of published reports saying how bad things are in River City. At this point, the women said that they wanted to inform me on behalf of the whole community. They had talked to most of the religious leaders, that they had no interest in having university researchers from what they described as the old school here to quote unquote help them. That instead they were looking for partners, folks who would listen eloquently, show cultural humility, and work on a new basis. And they described it as the non-colonial approach to community university partnership. A, they would decide, their community, what issues to be worked on. B, they would participate in each and every step of the organizing, research, planning, development, management process as equal partners with the university professional staff. 3, they weren't interested, I love this, in a one-night date with a young university researcher. The problems that they were dealing with were 60, 70 years in incubation in East St. Louis as an older industrial riverfront city. And they wanted a commitment of at least 5 years from the university so that serious work could be done to address serious problems. Fourth, they said, as soon as you get back to campus, we know you're going to begin thinking, probably on the ride back, of what funding sources could support this to cover your expenses without realizing what the expense to the community is of having university researchers there who they have to guide, get meetings, provide meeting space, support with food, introduce to the most significant civic leaders. So they wanted to make it clear that they would not participate in any research grant in which 50% of the funding wasn't allocated to the community, that we would have parity. We would both share the risk, we would both share the benefits. And last but not least, they didn't want just another one-off project, even if it lasted 5 years. They wanted the project from the very beginning to lay the foundation for a long-term, community-controlled nonprofit that could take the research that they would co-generate with their various partners and then have the capacity to do implementation. And these 5 principles we came to refer to as the Ceola Davis Accords for non-colonial community university participation. And it's those principles that led our small faculty and student group to embrace participatory action research as an initial approach. We then produced some fairly significant reports at the neighborhood level, which got a lot of media attention, but we lacked what Antoinette talked about, the broad base of political support to reinforce the findings in those research projects. So we began to integrate participatory action research with old-fashioned direct action organizing, a la Saul Alinsky, a la Wade Rathke, Cesar Chavez, other folks. And then we began to get some real results. And at the 10th anniversary of this growing community university partnership, which is largely the experience that enabled me to get tenure and establish a reputation in the engaged scholarship movement, I got called to a religious meeting at Miss Davis's church. I walked in, there are 60 community leaders. They're sitting in a circle. There's a chair for me in the middle as the director of this community partnership. And they asked me, we'd like to read you a quote and see what you think of it. And it was my quote of what empowerment planning is. And what do you think of this? Is this a good idea or a bad idea? At which point I said, I think it's brilliant. I think it was my idea. I think it's a great goddamn idea. At which point Miss Davis said, well, when are you gonna get off your ass and do that kind of work here in East St. Louis? And she then pointed out, we have a community university partnership. In order to do this complex economic and community development work, we're providing 10 to 15 hours of advanced graduate education for the architects, the planners, the engineers, the landscape architects, business management people, communications, organizational development folks, community psychology, so that the students could be good partners. And yet we weren't providing an hour's worth of training for the grassroots civic leaders who had created the democratic space which we were operating in to move the arc of the moral order towards justice. She said, you don't realize it because white folks from the university are always the last to know. They don't speak for everybody, but we're not even the tail on the dog of this community university partnership. We're the flea hoping to land on the tail on the dog. And they said, that's the bad news. The good news is we have a way to fix it. And they then proposed a neighborhood college based upon the Highlander Center for Citizen Education and Research. So they added to our paradigm of action research and direct action organizing, the critical education of Paulo Freire and Miles Horton. And that became our 3-legged approach to transformative community university engagement. Now, getting criticized by a group of working class Black women, even people you'd come to know and love, isn't easy for aging white guys from the academy. So on the drive back to the university, 2.5 hours, I used most of my 4-letter words that I learned in the South Bronx, describing how underwhelmed I was. Why didn't our community partners tell us day 1, year 2, year 5? Why did they have to wait 10 years? And then it finally dawned on me after 2 years of ranting that we hadn't built up enough of a license of trust as being good partners who wouldn't jump off of the boat when the first criticism comes, because that's what happens when you have resident-led change being supported by white allies. When everybody thinks it's great and they're singing Kumbaya at the dedication of the new daycare center, all the white folks are willing to hang out. But when you're challenging the allocation of public education funding or this tax base upon which it's based upon, property tax, and you're rocking the boat, folks who look like me generally exit, saying that we can't be political. Politics is a fight about values. It's the choices we make to advance the divine, the good, the better, the just, or not. Everything is political. We have to be explicit about what we're trying to do and who we are, and then we have to hold our partners accountable. And the reason it took 10 years for the East St. Louis women to hold our feet to the fire, the tenured professors in Urbana-Champaign, was not because it took them 10 years to figure it out. They knew in the first day, week, month, and year that we were on a journey that wasn't going to make us ready to hear this until we had enough investment in a joint effort. And even then it was difficult. So that's the approach that I've been pursuing. Action research, married to direct action organizing, and then the popular education. So we created a nonprofit school in East St. Louis that offers 10 to 12 courses a year, co-taught by grassroots leaders and a university partner, always a duet, and some 300 community leaders got that basic foundational training, the topics of which they chose, the themes, the issues, and also the instructors.
There's a lot there. I think there's definitely, in a nutshell, more work to be done. I think we've all been quite inspired by what you've offered here. It sounds doable. It sounds like we have everything we need. It's the how, it's the when, it's how to fix it. And so, I'm going to transition a little bit. We have about 20 minutes or so left, and I'd like to pay as much attention to some of the questions that were coming in through the chat here. And so I'll attempt to articulate those. A question becomes very similar to what we're already talking about, to what Ken and Antoinette have already offered for us in terms of trying to address the nature of what to do now, what to do next. How can we go beyond addressing problems to mitigating, to ameliorating those problems while solving them, and knowing that solving them might require a bit of a shift or a bit of a durability in campus community engagement?
So I'm reading the question now, because I think this is from Robert, correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So here's the challenge I have in this, Robert. We actually don't use the word solving or solution at our organization. Here's why. It's not like we're like, oh, let's just keep doing this work. No one wants to keep doing this work. People want to sleep and enjoy life. They don't want to constantly live in a state of trauma, right? That is not what people want. But we tend to talk about our work through how do we develop interventions and approaches versus solving. And the reason we say that is because usually when folks say, I want a solution, they're looking for one silver bullet is going to fix everything approach. And then what happens is that actually is used against the different types of intervention when it's especially on the opposite side of someone's opinion. So we saw this with the uprising in Ferguson. There were many different tactics that was used during the organizing, continues to be many different tactics. And I saw a lot of spaces saying, well, why they shouldn't protest that way. They shouldn't do this. They shouldn't do that. They shouldn't do it. And to the point where I was like, what should they do? Because apparently every single approach that you are naming should not be done because it's not effective for you. And some of it was some things that were very disruptive, interrupting a Muni presentation, which is one of our outside theaters, one of our largest theater companies. People were generally upset. It's like, it's a theater production. You are more upset about your theater production being interrupted than the continued Black bodies that are laying on the streets in our communities. What does that actually say? Or folks were upset when they did die-ins at our mall. Folks were upset, and I saw this even on both sides, like organizers were upset with the people that decided to stay inside of institutions and try to create change. People inside the institutions were upset with the folks outside of the institutions trying to create change, and it doesn't help anyone. And it actually takes me back to, because my master's is in communications and emphasis on cultural hegemony and nonprofit management and leadership. But one of the things that we talked about in one of my classes was how people respond to interventions differently. Some people, you give them the data and they're like, absolutely, I get what you're saying. Some people, you can give them all the data in the world and it would mean absolutely nothing to them. They need to hear the stories, the personal connection. And some folks, it's the spectrum. And so I view our work very similar. I tell folks usually two things. One, we take a very drops in a bucket approach, recognizing there's not one drop that's going to get us to that space of equity, but all of those different approaches and interventions and drops will get us closer and closer to that line of equity. And then hopefully beyond that to that space of liberation. But I also tell folks, because a lot of folks say, well, how do you stay in this work? Because this work is tiring. I tell people all the time, I view my work as cathedral building. When you think about cathedrals, because Ken, you were bringing up being raised Catholic. I also was raised Catholic, by the way. I'm not Catholic anymore, but I was raised Catholic. I'm non-denominational now. But when you think of cathedral building, cathedrals took many, many, many years to be built. And some of the original folks that were building the cathedrals knew that they would never see the full final product. But they understood the importance of that foundation that they were setting and the bricks that they were laying. They knew that their role in that moment, even if they didn't see the final outcome, was just as important as the person that was putting that last brick in. And so that's how we need to approach it, is that, yes, you are correct. Some approaches is literally very Band-Aid. And it's very surface level, and no one wants to hit the root cause of an issue. And there are a variety of approaches that we actually need to reach people in the different spaces of where they are to actually get to the outcome we're looking for. Because we also have to remember that we are dealing with centuries of oppression. This is not just George Floyd. George Floyd is a product, unfortunately, of a system that has been around for centuries. This is not just a product of Michael Brown Jr. or Sandra Bland. This is not just a product of our Asian community members that have been victims of brutality that we are just now noticing because of the videography of it, because it's been there. It's not like it just invented because apparently we can record it now. And I literally had someone say to me years ago, people haven't said that to me since, but it was a white man that said to me, well, racism didn't come to be until a social media. And when this person said this to me, I was like, you're joking, right? Like, do you really think that racism was invented with social media? No. What? Martin, I see your face up there. Martin's like, what? No. What happened is that we are no longer only seeing one or three narratives that are led by white people in power, particularly white men. We are now seeing that anyone can have a camera, anyone can write a post, anyone can share their narratives, and people can no longer be erased and silenced. And so when we think about the different ways we need to approach these issues, we need to recognize that it's going to take a lot. And we also need to think about what does the investment into sustainability look like beyond just those one-off efforts, which I do believe also is a problem. Because Ken talked about that report that nothing had ever happened, right? How many reports have you actually seen that have happened? How many committees have you maybe been invited to where here you are 3 years later going, so are we going to do anything here? Like, what is happening? Because we like to perform to say that we're accomplishing, but we do need to recognize that we do need to do things. And then we also need to think about the investment of sustainability at the same time, and also the investment of resources for community to own it beyond just the research phase, which is what also tends to happen.
Thank you, Antoinette. Ken, would you like to answer that?
Well, always dangerous following Antoinette, let me tell you. So thoughtful. Two things that I've taken from recent work, and that is, one, people's frustration with research, policy, process. Do you ever get around to doing anything? When I left Illinois and Ithaca to then settle in Memphis, I got invited by a group of AME ministers in South Memphis to work with them. And before I could get a minute into who I was, the elder minister got up and said, we've been studied to death. We just don't have the time. I'm going to be on the other side of the Mississippi, if you know what I mean, by the time you get done your report. So they said, as you begin working, you need to be thinking right away about what are the low-lying fruit that we can address that are meaningful, maybe not the ultimate problem, but we need to get over people's cynicism that this is just another talking head show run by the university, funded by the city and some distant liberal foundation. And so we, came across this work done by Hertzberg called the Ready, Fire, Aim method. Get people together, do a quick scan of the environment, and then take action on something that you can address with the resources and people at hand. So we did our first sort of community assessment in South Memphis. We promised that group of ministers that within 30 days of finishing the plan, we would have our first improvement project, shovels in the ground, whatever the heck that would be. And it ended up being reclaiming an overflow parking lot that used to be an old gas station and turning it into South Memphis's first farmer's market with incredible fruits, vegetables, dry goods, crafts, et cetera, all produced by African-American farmers from the tri-state area. It became the most successful farmers market outside of a downtown in the South. The momentum from that small victory, 600 people would come every Thursday and Friday to shop at the South Memphis Farmers Market, then got us the resources and momentum to convert a city bus into a mobile fruit, vegetable, dry goods, and health and wellness bus known as the Green Machine, that then serviced 20 neighborhoods each week, making 4 stops a day with this great food. And at the back, while you were checking out, there was a database, and then we would ask you, Aaliyah, are you currently seeing a doctor, nurse practitioner, or health provider? And you would say no. We would say, would you like to be? You'd say yes. What's your zip code? You'd give it to us, and we would give you the list of Medicaid supported practitioners and make the appointment while you're on the bus, call you the day before, see if you needed a ride from one of our student public health nursing planning students, and then the day after ask you how the experience was. The result was within a year, we reduced the percentage of folks on the bus who were coming for food, who were out of relationship with a health and wellness provider from 86% to just over 60%, which is extraordinary. That then led to the transformation of a vacant storefront into a small footprint Walmart-like fresh food store, all controlled by the community. But it's this notion of not waiting till the end of a process to think about what steps you could take to begin addressing real problems and using those small successes to allow other people to come forward to raise the scale, the impact, et cetera. It had an extraordinary impact. The other issue is, how do you evaluate community university partnerships? And one of my frustrations, I love the Campus Compact, but for years, it's been the university partners getting together for conferences, talking about the great things they're doing. It's sort of like marriage encounter, when only the men go away with the priest to talk about what's the state of marriage in our parish. It's not likely you're going to dig too deep when the women are not there to challenge assumptions and bring their knowledge, skill, passion, and insights to the process. And so one of the things I think we need to look about for community university partnerships that are in long-term work in communities is what structures do they create to have truly participatory evaluation on an annual basis. Now, when we worked in East St. Louis, we invited all of our community partners and all of our various student faculty teams to go away to a retreat house for 3 days. On Friday night, we had an inspirational speaker from a city that was really doing something different. Saturday morning, the community would evaluate the progress they were making towards their economic and community development goals. In the afternoon, they would sit down and evaluate A through F. They would give a report card to the university on the quality of the assistance that we were providing. And we got a lot of Fs, I can tell you that, even though it was a good project. But you learn from those, right? You don't want to repeat that. And then the community at the neighborhood level would identify their priorities and then come together as a citywide level and determine what work they wanted to get done. And then the leadership of the community-based organizations would sit down with the university administration, and we had the budget, and they would allocate the budget with us as to what work was going to be done. Occasionally, they would have 8 things that they said are essential to move us to the next level of transformative change, and we only had enough money for 6. But because of the strength of the relationships, the community and the fact that we had our funding partners at this annual community action retreat, an advance we used to call it, often the funders would, if there was an intriguing enough notion, say, we'll fund the 7th or 8th priority. And by involving people in a participatory evaluation, you finally get some very critical perspective on the university effort. And you also create the space for people to collectively look at their networks to see where additional resources could be identified to take on the next heavy lift that needs to be addressed. So that's something I think campuses should think about, doing their annual evaluation of their engagement program, but doing it on a completely collaborative basis with their community partners and their funders at a different site of significance to the community each year. And that was also important.
Excellent. There are a couple of people who had questions specific to what you mentioned, Ken, around the Ceola Davis Accord, wanting to know a little bit more about the accords. There's also a few questions that really deal with asking, how do we advocate within institutions of higher ed? How do you advocate for redirecting or demanding academic institutions to focus on the outcomes needed within the community, as opposed to reconciling the outcomes that are currently demanded within individualistic approaches to such as tenure and research. And so thinking through those questions around, how do we get to a point of cycling through a status quo, a situation where the atrocities continue and perpetuate to moving beyond what has been done in the past. And there's another question then, so to bring it all together, it really becomes around, it centers around the notion of allyship. What can white people, particularly in higher ed spaces, do to address the censoring that you all discussed, so that it's not always on the shoulders of those who have been most oppressed, most marginalized, most disenfranchised? How can people in higher ed spaces address what we're talking about here in terms of the atrocities, so that it's not just on the shoulders of the people who live in the communities, the Black and Indigenous people of color who continue to be exposed by the trauma?
Well, I think, one of the things I always try to be conscious of is who has the power to set priorities and budgets within the higher ed system in the state that I'm working in, and to think about as you begin to identify good colleagues who are working in communities that are doing very good, effective, transformative work at the neighborhood and citywide level, to begin to bring them together to think about how we begin to tell this story of this bottom-up change process, not on our own campus as much, but within the state legislature's higher ed finance committee, within, if there's a statewide board of regents that has oversight responsibility for the individual campuses, And also thinking about on the campus, most of us have annual reports that we have to do that rarely ask about our engaged scholarship. And if that can be added to those formal reviews, they could also be geocoded so that you could indicate where good work is being done, which would help the people on campus identify who might be in the same neighborhood doing public health work, but I don't know about them because I'm doing urban design work. That would facilitate good work. It would also, because if we're at a public university, it would give community people access to that database so that they could find good partners. But it would also allow us to aggregate the extraordinary amount of justice-oriented work that's happening in the academy that is not now getting reported on, because it's not the way you get promoted in tenure. That could have relevance and power and influence over higher ed policy at the state. If only we could collect the data, and you could do, a little bit of IT work that's giving those guys a good opportunity to show their social justice bona fides, to create composite annual reports that would show an elected official, state rep or state senator or US congressman or congresswoman or US senator, what is already happening for this modest investment and what could happen if there was more significant support for it. And that is doing an end around, run around your own provost and chancellor, who most institutions just are not going to privilege this work. I mean, we have a great group of higher ed officials in Campus Compact, but if you look back historically, there's been a very quick disappearance of bold, social justice oriented truth tellers at the presidential and chancellor's level. You think back of the 60s, 1960s to now, and it's because public institutions are less well supported by state public support. So they have to raise money privately and they don't want to do anything that's controversial. So you have fewer prophetic voices in the academy at the highest level. So that means we're going to have to replace those voices with a grassroots movement that sees the power of coalition between community groups, their municipal officials who want to see this change continue, and university faculty who can build their own pathways to the state capitol with their own stories and begin to shift the narrative and shift the funding priorities. So it's I guess it was one of the great writers on military science, von Clausewitz, his book on war is called The Strategy of the Indirect Approach. If you're too small, there are too many colonists shooting BB guns at the British, take the indirect, hide behind trees. So this would be our faculty and community partners going to the state capitol without going through the campus intergovernmental affairs and lobbying machinery, which will never privilege what we do.
Wow. Okay. And Antoinette, we have about 5 more minutes, but we really would like to hear from you in terms of that response. Yeah, or your response. Mm-hmm.
I think Ken hit it. I mean, I don't know what else to really add to that. Yeah, I mean, I struggle a bit with these type of questions because there's a reason why I left higher education. And I'm pretty sure you don't want me to say leave. So like, take Ken's approach. I also will say, like, use your privilege in the best way that you can. Be willing to sacrifice. And I made choices, and some folks, that's the biggest barrier. Many folks are not willing to risk. And I made the choice years ago that I was okay with whatever consequences came my way, positively or negatively, with me authentically doing this work. That has negatively affected me and that's positively affected me. We had funders show up now saying, I've been following your work since 2018, and you literally have authentically stayed true to your path. And because of that, we want to invest in you. And that came from literally a conversation that we had 3 years ago. And they showed up, they invested $200K. It was like, okay, it was like the largest grant we had received at that time. And then they turned back around and say, you know what, we're going to give you another $500K. And it's like, and that came from them seeing that I was authentically true and not willing to sway. We've lost funding opportunities though, because I have been very honest and authentic. And so I think there's this need to really look at what am I willing to risk and sacrifice, and what do I mean when I say I want to be an actual ally? Because there are many students at these universities, at these colleges, that are sacrificing so that they can push for a better opportunity. You are seeing students pushing back on faculty, pushing back on policy. And if they're able to do it, why can't we? And I think that's something that we're not doing enough of really saying, what am I willing to actually lose? Because Colin Kaepernick, people can feel whatever way they want about him. He knew he was risking his career. And in some cases, he did lose a lot, his passion. But his other passion that was really important to him has returned even bigger opportunities and outcomes because he was able to stay true to what he believed. And one of the last things I'm going to mention, and I'm not telling us to go, and this is going to sound really bad when I give this example, just hear me out. A lot of folks like to call out Martin Luther King Jr. Oh, especially when the holiday comes, you see all the quotes. Everyone wants to put it on Instagram. Okay, let's call out Martin Luther King Jr. and one of his speeches. But what they forget is that he sacrificed a lot for us to be able to quote him, for us to be able to say we want to pursue that dream. One of the most poignant pieces he created was Letter in Birmingham jail. He was in jail, sacrificing so that we can read what he wrote years later. And it wasn't so that he could be recognized. It's because he believed in something true and he was willing to risk it. And so I ask you all, what are you willing to risk? Because there are many colleagues of color that are risking every single day because they feel like they have to do this work. What are you willing to actually lose to actually be an ally to push against these systems for change?
Antoinette, Ken, thank you very much. We are all, completely humbled by your willingness to share your stories, your examples. The opportunity to have this discussion obviously rests within a growing response to a concern, the racial, environmental injustices that occur. It's a crisis in our social systems. And so the response to that crisis is taking that deeper look into what you have articulated and replicated through those philosophical practices, those theoretical practices that become practice. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.